right, everyone, I'm going to convene us and get us started. Good afternoon. How are we doing? Can we hear me? Really? Should I break into song? Turn it up louder? I don't think I have control over that part. Let's see. Do I have control over the volume? Oh, okay. Well, yeah, well, that helps, you know. It does help. Please feel free to start eating. That's the first most important instruction of the afternoon. I'm really delighted to be here, and I'm happy that you all are here. We're running a little bit late, so I want to get started and make sure we have enough time for the kind of engagement and serious dialogue and communication that Robin DiAngelo is going to provide. So I'm really thrilled that we're hosting this event again. It's really important to have opportunities to think through issues of diversification, power, inequality, and how they play out in higher education, and I'm thrilled that Brown is really becoming a leader in this way. But I'm also super thrilled to collaborate with Lisa Cariago-Lowe. We have so much fun doing lots of different things. We always are like, yeah, good idea. I don't think we've ever thought an idea was not good together. And so it's fantastic to partner with her on this issue and many other programs. She's had a really powerful impact on the campus, and I'm grateful. I want to just tell you a couple of things about CSREA very briefly, and then introduce our fantastic speaker. So I'm the director of the Center for the Study of Race and Ethnicity in America at Brown University. I'm also the Chancellor's Professor of Africana Studies, and I'm in the Dean's Office for Special Initiatives, which means I have 3 jobs, and they are all seemingly closer to 100% than seems appropriate. But they're all incredibly important work, and they dovetail together beautifully. The center in particular is a research center at Brown that supports and generates rigorous and accessible. This is something we're very proud of fostering, rigorous and accessible research on a broad range of issues pertaining to race and ethnicity in America. We try to build community among scholars and students working in these areas, and we try to foster generative public conversations, sometimes on difficult but always on important issues. We have lots of different kinds of programming. If you go to our website, just put race, ethnicity at Brown in a search engine and our center will come up. But one program we developed since I've been director is called the Third Rail Lecture Series. And this is our 2016-27 annual speaker co-sponsoring with this event of the Third Rail Series. And the Third Rail Series aims to address some of the most thorny and contentious issues related to race and ethnicity in American society. So we chose the title Third Rail quite intentionally. I mean, as in general colloquial terms, when we say it's a third rail topic, it's to be avoided. It produces a lot of anxiety. People immediately pull away from it. I mean, certainly whiteness and white fragility would fit this description. It's not unplanned cocktail chit-chat. But the third rail is also a source of energy. If you think about, I'm a New Yorker, so for me the third rail was the thing not to fall into the tracks and touch, because you wouldn't make it home. But the third rail is also a source of energy, and it supplies high voltage power to a train on an electric railway. And so if you think of it metaphorically, you can think that if we harness the energy and knowledge of third rail topics in an appropriate way for social good, it might actually take us really where we need to go. And today's luncheon keynote speaker, we're exceptionally fortunate to have her because she takes on this issue with the kind of grace and seriousness that we need. Today she will speak on white fragility and its impact on diversity and inclusion efforts on campuses. Robin DiAngelo has been a consultant and a trainer for more than 20 years on issues of race and social justice. Her areas of research are in whiteness studies and critical discourse analysis, and she explicates how whiteness is reproduced in everyday narratives and practices. She's the author of What Does It Mean to Be White? Developing White Racial Literacy, and Is Everyone Really Equal? An Introduction to Key Concepts in Critical Social Justice Education. In particular, she's advanced the increasingly influential idea of white fragility as a critical facet of the way communities resist racial justice efforts. And I found this concept generative and quite productive because it illuminates how it functions both individually on an interpersonal level, but also structurally. And I remember reading it relatively recently again, and in the context of all of the public narratives about challenging students of color's apparent capacity to be triggered by anything, and that somehow they're the reason that there's conflict on campus because they're upset about inequality and injustice and mistreatment. And what's brilliant about white fragility is that it speaks about white being triggered by the very fact of being challenged. So it helps us see that there's a whole reversal of the project here, and she'll connect this when she gets here. But in any event, white fragility is critically important to our understanding of how race and racism works on campuses. And it seems to me if we're going to take seriously the diversification efforts in which we're involved, we can't simply talk about non-whites. We have to talk about the entire picture of the way race is playing out. And there would obviously be no need to talk about diversity without whiteness as a social structure. So anyway, join me in welcoming Robin DiAngelo to Brown.
Thank you so much. I got to remember to stand right there. I have a relatively brief period of time with you, so I'm just going to launch right into it and draw your attention to my race. I'm white. Check me out, everybody. And part of being white is that goes against all my socialization. I was not raised to think about myself in racial terms. Somebody had a race, of course, but not me. And I certainly wasn't raised to think about my race as relevant in any way to my life experience. So to be standing in front of you and leading from that is counter again to how I was socialized. I am very clear today that I am white. And I have a white frame of reference, a white worldview, and I move through the world with a white experience. And it is not just a universal human experience. It is a most particularly white experience in a society that is profoundly separate and unequal by race. So while I'm always coming from that position, I just want to be really explicit about it today. And in a kind of master's tools dilemma, to decenter whiteness, you have to center it in a different kind of way than the way it normally remains centered, right? Through its unmarked, unnamed, and as you were saying, right, the kind of projecting onto everybody else, but never looking at who's the problem, basically, right? And so to center it, but shine light on it, to expose it, is to decenter it. And while people of color, from a very early age, have to know my reality in a way that I'm sorry to say I don't have to know theirs. This may still be useful in that I'm going to name and admit to things that are so rarely ever named or admitted to by white people. So that may be useful for you if you've ever wondered how on earth we can pull off what we pull off. I'll lay that out for you. For the white folks in the room, I've never met a white person who didn't have an opinion on racism. Have you? Let me know if you have. If you're not sure about it, just bring it up the next time you're around a lot of white folks. We all have opinions, and they tend to be really emotional. But if we have not devoted years of sustained study, struggle, and focus, our opinions are necessarily limited, because nothing in dominant society gives us the information we need to have the complex, nuanced understanding of arguably the most complex, nuanced social dilemma since the beginning of this country. In fact, you can get through graduate school in this country without ever discussing racism. Can you not? You can get through law school in this country without discussing racism. And you can get through teacher education in this country without discussing racism. If you're in a progressive teacher education program, you'll have one required multicultural education course. The faculty will have fought for that course for 10 frickin' years, and that's no guarantee you'll be discussing racism in that course. You might be just discussing multi-ethnic authors and how to introduce them. So my challenge to the white folks in this room is, no matter where you are on this lifelong continuum, is to listen from a place of humility and openness. That's our challenge. Okay? So white fragility is the inability for white people to tolerate racial stress. And racial stress is basically anything that challenges our positions, what we feel entitled to, our identities, and we don't respond very well, right? And we push back to block or stop the challenge and to kind of get back into our, what I think of as our racial equilibrium, our racial comfort. Right? And so the first part is mapping out how we come to kind of be inculcated in white fragility and then how it manifests, right? So by every measure across every institution in this country, there's racial disparity, right? I think we all know this, even in spite of our narratives of meritocracy and individualism. Every institution, every measure, racial disparity, right? At the same time, what is today's dominant racial narrative? Well, I'm a former professor of education, so I used to teach in a large teacher training program. The program, it was in Westfield, Massachusetts, and it was 97% white. It was rare for me to ever have a student of color in any class, and we were 10 miles from Springfield, Massachusetts, which is 57% Black and Latinx, right? And on the first day of class, I would ask my students to write me an anonymous reflection on a couple key questions. What are some of the ways how racially diverse were your schools and neighborhoods growing up? What are some of the messages you've received across your life about race? And what are some of the ways in which your race has shaped your life? And what I'm going to show you is representative of the hundreds of these anonymous reflections I've collected over the years from our future teachers in their junior and senior years of university, soon to be certified as highly educated, and set forth to teach in those schools in Springfield. My neighborhood growing up was not racially diverse at all. Every family in my neighborhood was also Caucasian. Throughout my time in school, I have continually been taught that skin does not matter. Is that familiar to you? It should be. It is the dominant white racial narrative. It is definitely a post-civil rights narrative, not a pre-civil rights narrative. But I see a really big contradiction in this narrative, which is, I'm assuming obvious to you, if race doesn't matter, why so separate? And from that comes a question for me. How do we actually teach that race doesn't matter in segregation? Well, I would argue that's not what we teach at all. It's what we tell. It's not what we teach through the practice of our lives. Right? So the question that drives my work is, how do we pull this off? How do they pull that off, sitting in such explicit segregation? Right? I would also say that while this is a post-civil rights narrative, this is apparently the younger generation, that when my generation dies off, there'll be no more racism, right? Because it's all the old people. You heard that one? Yeah. No. I don't think this is any more transgressive. It's actually quite a brilliant adaptation to the challenges of the civil rights movement, right? Okay, and by the way, this is why I don't just affirm everybody's opinion in my classes. I know it's a little counter to the sacredness of everybody's opinion, but these opinions are not informed, right? And they function really problematically. So racism, let's just really quickly, is a system. It is embedded across all institutions, and it results in a consistent reproduction of unequal distribution of resources between white people overall and people of color overall, with white people as the beneficiaries of that system. Right? And that, of course, goes against what dominant culture's definition is, which is individual acts of intentional meanness. And if you don't do those, you're outside of this conversation, right? So Marilyn Fry is a scholar who uses the metaphor of a birdcage to kind of push against this dominant narrative of it's just all about individuals. And I think it's a beautiful metaphor. I think a lot in metaphors. And so she says, if you walk up to that birdcage and you put your face all the way against the cage, and so you're taking a very micro or myopic view, you're not going to see the cage at all. You're not going to see the wires at all, maybe a little bit on your peripheral vision, and you're going to say, what's the problem? Why doesn't that bird just fly away? The little door's open in the cage. What's going on? But if you move back and you begin to take a wider view, You begin to see these bars and these bars and these bars, and you begin to see the interlocking system and nature of oppression, in this case, racism. So let's look at what some of those are. Our institutions, our ideology, internalized oppression, constant microaggressions, isolation, embedded in culture, invisibility, the burden of representation. I'm going to imagine the folks of color in this room can relate to the burden of representation, always carrying the psychic weight of racialization where I don't carry that weight. Rewards for conformity, keep white people comfortable, you're going to get further along. Constant threats of violence, deeply embedded in our history, and unacknowledged historical trauma, to name a few. Right? And just to give a glimpse, I do believe there's something deeply and specifically anti-Black in this culture and in the white consciousness. And that does not mean that all groups of color don't suffer under racism and white supremacy. But when I want white folks to connect to the racial other, I think for us, Black people are the ultimate racial other, and by every measure tend to be at the bottom. So just a quick glance at essentially what Tanisha Coates would call the organized crime against African Americans throughout history and into the present, right? So I show this to you to contrast it again with the dominant definition, which is that it is simply individual, dislike and intentional meanness. Right? So in spite of this, I think the most brilliant adaptation of racism post-civil rights was what I think of as the good-bad binary. So post-civil rights, to be a good moral person and to be complicit with racism became mutually exclusive. You couldn't be a good moral person and be complicit with racism. Racists were, they had fire hoses and they beat people and dragged them away from lunch counters. That was a racist, right? And if I wasn't that, I was a good person. And I think it's made it virtually impossible to talk to white people about the inevitable racism that we absorb, internalize, and participate in. I think it's the root of virtually all white defensiveness. Have you noticed any white defensiveness, anybody? Okay. Right, so I've got this incredibly simplistic understanding of racism. You suggest something I have done has a racist impact, I'm going to hear a literal challenge to my moral character. And I'm going to need to defend my moral character. I know you've seen this. And I will defend my moral character. And I will do it by basically invalidating that it was racism in whatever way I can do that. So it's this either-or conceptualization. And we really have to be ever vigilant today because it's so easy to fall into this trap of the people here versus the people here. I don't even want to invoke the names, but I think you know what I mean. This kind of distancing that progressive whites are outside of this. I actually think progressive whites, I'm going to be really honest, are the most challenging. And I'm a progressive white, by the way. I'm talking about myself, right? Because the degree to which we think we're good to go, that's where our energy is going to go to, is making sure you understand that we're good to go, and not to where it needs to be going for the rest of our lives, which is deep, deep reflection and action, right? So we know how to fill this in, right? Racists are bad, and they're ignorant and bigoted and prejudiced. They're mean-spirited. They're old. They're Southern. They drive pickup trucks because we can get some classism in there, and they live in Manchester. I don't know, I don't live around here, but they don't live in Providence, that's for sure, right? And you're not racists are good, and they're educated and progressive and open-minded and well-intended. They're young, they're Northern, they shop at the co-op. Not Whole Foods. Whole Foods is a corporation, they don't shop at Whole Foods. But they do love Trader Joe's, and they're moving to Portland, Oregon really soon. Okay. All right. So this either or, right? I mean, it's just, I'm confident that you've seen it, and we got to get rid of it, right? It is not an either or. It is an inevitable function of being raised in this culture, right? So in doing this work, I hear the same narratives from white people on the topic of racism over and over. I do have a rather rare job for a living every single day. I'm in front of predominantly white groups talking about racism. And as I listen, it's as if somebody just handed us a script. And actually, they have just handed us a script. It's called socialization, right? There's a reason these narratives are so predictable. And so the image that came to my mind as I listened was like of a pier or a dock. And that signifies for me how surface and superficial these narratives are. And at the same time, a pier or a dock looks as if it's just floating on the surface of that water, but it's not. There's a whole structure and foundation propping it up. And so I want us to examine that structure underneath by doing some critical discourse analysis of these narratives. So let's see if you haven't heard these. I was taught to treat everyone the same. That's probably the number one. So I don't want to set you up, but I'll tell you that I often will say to a group, how many of you were taught to treat everyone the same? And almost every hand goes up. And then I say, no, you weren't. Right? No one in this room or any room was taught to treat everyone the same in the sense that you could learn to do that. You could be told to do it, and I'm sure you were. It's not humanly possible, and thank goodness we have the research on implicit bias to show us that, right? So when I hear this from a white person, the bubble over my head is, ooh, doesn't understand basic socialization, doesn't understand culture, is not particularly self-aware. Okay? I see people as individuals. I don't care if you're pink, purple, polka dotted. I hope, basically, don't ever say that. That's all I gotta say. Racism in the past, everyone struggles, but if you work hard. My parents weren't racist, that's why I'm not racist. My parents were racist, that's why I'm not racist. It doesn't matter what comes first, what comes second must be, I am not racist, okay? And, you know, so-and-so just happened to be black, but it has nothing to do with the fact that no one in our office gets along with her. So this is one, no, that one touched a nerve, did it? Okay. This is one, oof, I didn't get a chance to super lay down the difference between prejudice and discrimination, which everybody has, and racism, but we can remove the word reverse. There is no reverse form of racism. It is, by definition, a system, right? Thank you. Prejudice and discrimination, everybody has that, so using reverse there is kind of nonsensical, okay? And since I have a captive audience, just so you know, what I say to white folks is, I would suggest that you remove anything that begins with just happens to be, regardless of, but at the human level, right? Because what we're doing in that move is basically taking race off the table and positioning some kind of universal experience. And there is not a universal experience, not in this culture. I might not know what race has to do with the fact that no one in the office seems to like this person, but I need to be willing to look at how her race is shaping the way that I see her. And this is where the research on implicit bias just says it is shaping it, whether I'm conscious of it or not, okay? So these are all colorblind, right? These are all colorblind. You basically say, I don't see it, and if I see it, it has no meaning. Probably the folks in this room are beyond colorblind, right? You recognize it wasn't realistic. It was quite a clever co-optation of Martin Luther King's work, and its function to deny and protect white racism, basically. So what do those co-op shopping types say? I'm gonna get us, okay? We say stuff like this, oh, I work in a very diverse environment. Oh, I have people of color in my family. Me? I'm not racist, I used to live in New York. I really have heard this. And the bubble over my head is, you walked by people of color and you didn't lose your shit? You are unbelievable. Like, clearly. Okay. I told you I like to make fun of white progressives. How many of you in a conversation with a white person on racism have heard some version of these? Okay, probably everybody, because these are ours, right? So now let's do a little discourse analysis here, right? A white person who invokes some version of these narratives is basically giving you their evidence, right? Here's my evidence. In my mind, what is this my evidence of? What am I trying to make sure you understand? Super simple question. I'm not racist, right? So if this is my evidence, what is my definition of a racist? And it's so simple, and yet, I mean, in terms of the question, but it is so rarely ever asked or interrogated by white people, right? So let's back around to it. Clearly, if this is my evidence that I'm not racist, then a racist couldn't do these things, okay? Racist couldn't work 3 cubicles down from a person of color. Folks of color in the room, could a racist work 3 cubicles down from you? Okay. Couldn't have people of color in their family and couldn't live in New York. And I can think of at least one person who lives in New York who I think is racist. All right, so even an avowed open, I support white supremacy person can do all these things. You do realize that, right? Racists can do these things, okay? So on that level, this is not good evidence, right? But essentially, I think the definition this rests on is a racist cannot tolerate the sight of people of color. I mean, look at it. Look at this. This is our evidence of our lack of racism. What other definition of a racist could you hold if this is what you're invoking, right? They apparently couldn't walk by them, couldn't work near them. A racist has conscious dislike or actually conscious virtual intolerance of people of color, right? And so right there we can see it's a really problematic definition. It's not remotely accurate. It doesn't take into account implicit bias. It doesn't take into account institutional structural racism, right? And the reason I think, for me, it's been really important to kind of figure out how they're constructing a racist is because then I know where to go with them, right? So what do I need to help them see? And I want to play just for a minute with I have people of color in my family. That's a little more sensitive. What I can tell you is for myself, one of the most powerful ways I have worked to challenge my socialization into this society has been to build a variety of authentic, sustained cross-racial relationships. Very little in my life set that up to happen in any kind of way that would be natural or easy. And I'm not talking I work near people. I mean truly in my life, at my table, right? And yet, those relationships are not free of racism. So let me just ask the folks of color again. Do you have any white people in your life who got some racism? Of course, right? And it comes out. It comes out in all kinds of ways. And we seem to be able to do this with gender, right? So how many of the people in the room who identify, I'm going to use cisgender terms, who identify as women have a primary intimate partnership with someone who identifies as a man? All righty, so you got a man in your life, do you? Okay, so the day he fell in love with you, all his sexism just vanished, right? Yeah. How could he possibly have any sexism? He loves you. Oh, and if you're not sure about your current partner, just think about your ex. You'll get right in touch with it. And let me give a shout out to the men. If you have a primary relationship with a woman, are there any gender differences you find frustrating? Of course, right? I'm clear that gender is a deep construct, but it is a deep construct, and I have been socialized into my gender role, and it manifests across gender, and it will for the rest of my life and rest of my relationship. I would never say, oh, I'm married to a man, yeah, so I have a gender-free life. Au contraire, right? Right? We understand this, but I want you to just notice how we do it with race. When it comes to race, if there is fond regard all racism and significance of race disappears. There's something so specific in the white consciousness to distance ourselves from race. Okay, children are so much more open. This is a cherished narrative. Sadly, I think most people in the room probably understand that the research shows by age 3 to 4, all children who grow up here understand that it's better to be white. That's hard to say, but no child misses the message, and not a single person in the room missed the message, it's better to be white. And it's not an isolated message, it's relentless. I'll show you some images of that coming up shortly, right? So when we project this romanticized innocence, racial innocence onto children, we leave them unattended to the message with no way to resist it. Parents of color understand that and are much less likely to leave them unattended because the consequences for their children are very different than the consequences for mine who are white when I let them just internalize white superiority. Okay. What do I know? I'm just a white guy. I added that one. I'm not really sure if it's a color blind or a color progressive, but have you ever heard that move? Kind of looks like they're aware that they have white privilege, and yet it still positions the person as racially innocent and not to be held accountable. Right? I think it's problematic. I already know all this. Yeah, I mean, I've been to Costa Rica, people, so it's been a week there. The people are so incredible. Okay, this one, when people say to me, you're speaking to the choir, I mean, I'm going to be honest, it's like, I'll be the judge of that. I actually don't think the choir, I mean, I am the least qualified person to assess how well I'm doing or how far along I am. And so the arrogance of this, I'll just have to be blunt, the lack of humility is incredible to me. And so when white people just feel like they already know everything there is to know, I think that's very problematic. And I don't think convincing to people of color. We don't like how white our neighborhood is, but we had to move here for the schools. Okay? We could do a whole session on that. I'm just going to say I think it's disingenuous. So these are the white progressive narratives. These are the first set was the kind of I don't see color, and these ones are I celebrate and love diversity, right? They both function the same way. They both function to take race off the table, to take racism off the table, and to basically say, I am exempt from this. And that's the question that I always use when I'm trying to figure out something in terms of a narrative or a pattern. How does it function? This does not function for us to keep going, right? This is a kind of nothing to see here, okay? So we want to go under there and figure out what is allowing us to say such things in such a separate and unequal society. So I'm going to give you a chance, I'm going to give you only a couple minutes, so I would go just to one person next to you if you can do it, depending on how many are at your table. Which of these narratives have you heard or have you used, if you're white, let's be honest, a white person who hasn't used one of these narratives, I don't know if they would have been a functioning member of this society. So which ones have you used if you're white? And which ones, if you're a person of color, do you hear white people use to deny the impact of race on their lives? So just I'm giving you a minute to connect to it. Okay, welcome back. Welcome back. Welcome back. Just keep saying it. Welcome back, everybody. Yes, welcome back. Hey, everybody, welcome back. Welcome back. Welcome. Okay, we're going to get started. If you can see me, raise your hand. If you can see me, raise your hand. If you can see me, raise your hand. Thank you. That's a teacher trick. these are the last conversations I ever want to interrupt, but I am on a time crunch, so we're going to keep going. And there's a couple of key questions that I often have white folks think about. I'll just talk you through them. The first one is to think about how racially diverse our neighborhoods were growing up and the messages we've gotten about race from our neighborhoods. The majority of white people grow up in primarily white neighborhoods. And the messages are, one, that it is normal to live apart, maybe even natural to live apart, and I think at a deeper level, righteous to live apart. When you think about the way we talk about white neighborhoods versus neighborhoods that we associate with black and brown people, right? So a white neighborhood tends to be good, safe, sheltered, clean, abundant, hardworking people who deserve what they have. Those are powerful messages. And we get discouraged from knowing or exploring black and brown space. We get warned, right? So we internalize a sense of ourselves, a deep sense of ourselves as good people, as deserving people. This shapes our identity. And I'm doing it to move white people past this idea again that as long as I'm friendly to people of color, I have not internalized anything, right? The next thing I ask white folks to think about is when's the first time they had a teacher of the same race as they are? And when's the first time they had a teacher of a different race? And how often did that happen? And of course, that's a question that people of color also answer. And generally the answer is, if you're white, from the time you began, and you could get through graduate school, rarely if ever in your entire life, looking up and not seeing yourself reflected at the front of the room. And if you're a person of color, your answer is likely to be, rarely if ever in my life have I looked up and seen myself reflected, right? That's the overall pattern. There's exceptions to every pattern, but. So most of us basically get taught by white people, who've been 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 taught by white people, using textbooks written for, by, and about white people. So that white worldview is very, very deep. White as authority, white as role model, white as holder of knowledge. And white teachers answer these questions really similarly. And so where are we getting our information? Very, very problematic sources, and I think I'll just cut to the chase. We see this in the school-to-prison pipeline. And this has been empirically shown, that these decisions are made with racial disparity. So I just have an image that for me sums this up really powerfully. This is from last year's College Champion Jeopardy playoffs. Those are our best and our brightest. And that is literally the board at the end of their round. And there's one category, not one of them touched. Obviously the hardest category, and nobody wanted to risk losing. And I don't feel that I can do justice to the profundity of this disconnect, this incredible disconnect from our history. Because you know what's under that category is civil war and civil rights, always, as if that happened in a vacuum and it's outside of my history, or that it isn't the history of this country, okay? So Joe Fagan has the concept of the white racial frame, and it's the academic articulation of what I think of as the pillars propping up the dock, right? So the deeply internalized framework through which whites make racial meaning, and it includes images, interpretations, perceptions, etc., talking about segregated white neighborhoods as good and safe is an example, right? That position whites as superior and that are reinforced and passed down across society. And I'll just start showing you some images that surround us all every day that I think capture. This is on a science website right now. What would a scientifically perfect face look like? This is an ad that I was on a Delta flight last year, and this ad was in the In-Flight magazine. Just look at the racial hierarchy in this ad. Look at the Asian women in the middle wearing yellow and the black women in the back wearing brown. And then notice that this is an ad for a purse. Look at the hands of the black women. Again, you just look for a second, but it's this constant message of status and hierarchy in relationship to resources. Their hands are empty, they don't have the purse. This ad is a little bit older. I think it's incredible. It's for Intel. Multiply computing performance and maximize the power of your employees. 6 shirtless brown men kneeling at this white man's feet. Look at the body language. This is a newer example of that. This is from The Blind Side, right? I was looking at CNN, and they have those little side stories that get your attention, and this one is most beautiful women from around the world, and representing South Africa, which is 92% black country. And I'm gonna use the term now, white supremacy. This, for me, is such a cogent example of white supremacy. And when I use the term, I mean it in a sociological sense, which is white as superior, as ideal, as the norm for humanity, and everyone else as a deviation from that norm. So these, we often talk about the struggles that students of color have, and we also need to look at what white people, faculty, staff, and students have internalized about themselves, because there's a relationship, and it's the end of the relationship we rarely examine, right? So just quickly, how has race shaped my life? Everything I'm about to say, every other white person in the room can say, no person of color in the room can say. So I was born into a culture in which I belong, in virtually any situation deemed normal, neutral, or valuable. That faculty meeting, that church service, block party, dealing with my daughter's teachers, her camp counselors, that wedding. How many of you have been to a wedding? If it wasn't all white, it was pretty close. Maybe your own, okay? Just rarely ever me that carries that psychic weight. Represented in the government, we know what the presidency, vice presidency has looked like, House of Representatives. I'm going to show you a series of photos now of the halls of power in the US, and where you see a yellow border around the picture, those are the people of color in the group. These are our US senators. These are the leaders of the largest US companies, US Supreme Court, US governors, US top military advisors, people who decide which TV shows we see, people who choose which movies get made, people with the most influence over which books we read, people who decide which music gets produced, people who decide what news is covered, owners of men's pro basketball teams, owners of men's pro football teams, owners of men's pro baseball teams, presidents of Ivy League universities. So you're just going to have to trust me that I wasn't attached to whether this was a Republican or Democrat or whatever my feelings are about Paul Ryan. It's that when I saw this picture, it's like, this is what it means to be white. This is Paul Ryan and his incoming group of interns. To be white is to be included, to belong, to have advantage, opportunity, networking, systems of support, to be separate. And now label this with any other group of people who will be at the tables to make decisions to affect other people's lives. Imagine now these are not just our future politicians, but the medical researchers, the professors, the teachers. I was raised Catholic. I don't know that there's a more powerful image than God. And even God was white or is white. Jesus and Mary. Constant messages that it's better to be white. I'm pulling from these magazines because they surround us. We have Halle Berry under best hair, but we can see what her hair looks like. 2015's World's Most Beautiful Woman. 2016's World's Most Beautiful Woman. I was racially affirmed throughout my childhood. I'll just give you one picture that I think sums it up from today. And these are the top 5 Miss Teen USA runners-up. And yes, they are different girls. Okay, and again, take it in, right? Just Miss Teen USA, right? Of course, we can look at what this does to young girls of color, but I also want white girls to look at what it does to us, okay? And here's the group they were drawn from, okay? And, you know, this is how it usually, there's one. And knowing my people, I'm going to tell you that probably all those white girls are going to tell you they're not racist because she was their best friend and she was in the group, right? And that just shows that, right? It's this very simplistic reduction, right, to fond regard. Right? So these are shows many of us grew up with. They're all about ideal friendship. They take place across the decades. Seinfeld the 80s, Sex and the City in the 90s, Friends in the 2000s, that's Gossip Girl, there's Girls. Every one of these shows takes place in New York City. So even amongst diversity, the relentless message to white people is there's no inherent value in an integrated life. So I think perhaps the most powerful way that my life has been shaped by my race is that I could be born into, I could learn, I could play, I could worship, I could study, I could love, I could work, and I could die in racial segregation. And not one single person in my life who's ever guided or mentored me has ever conveyed to me that I've lost anything. I'm going to say this a couple times in a couple ways because I think it's the deepest message of new racism. Right? I could go to my grave. That could be my funeral. My wedding looked a lot like that. I could go to my grave without really knowing just few, if any, authentic cross-racial relationships. And no one has suggested any loss whatsoever to my life. In fact, white people measure the value of our lives by the absence of people of color. I know what a good school is, and I know what a good neighborhood is. And when we communicate this, so what I'm working on here is pushing white folks way past this idea about individual intentions to look at the deep foundation of internalized superiority that comes out of our pores. My psychosocial development was inculcated in the water of white supremacy. Left unchecked, it's coming out of my pores. And I'm going to trust that the people of color in the room see it coming out of our pores, right? And so it's not a matter of good or bad or guilt, but it is a matter of inevitability and then taking responsibility. So if we go back to the props, I think this is what props up racism today, what Bonilla Silva calls racism without racists. Nobody's racist anymore, and yet we have the same inequitable outcomes we've always had. Okay. So this sets up some really common patterns in white folks, and just being conscious of the time, I'm just going to kind of move through these, and you can download this. But when any of this gets challenged, when our entitlement, when our sense of identity, when the sense that we are individuals, even me saying what I'm saying, generalizing about white people will get a lot of white people's backs up. How can you know anything about me just because I'm white, right? We don't like that. So we react, right, when any of this kind of deep insulation and entitlement is challenged. And it's not weakness. The word fragility might sound weak. It's fragile in that I can't tolerate the challenge, but the way I will get the challenge off of me actually, I think, functions as a form of bullying. I'm going to make it so miserable for you to challenge me, you're just not going to do it anymore. Okay? And so if I need to cry, I'll cry. If I need to get my back up and go get a bunch of people to go into an agreement with me, I'll do that, right? And in that way, I think white fragility functions as a form of everyday white racial control, right? So I'm not the 1%, but this can keep the people of color in my orbit in their place. Can you relate to how many times you've just let it go because it isn't worth it? So it functions quite powerfully, right? Okay. So what I'm thinking is, should we have people at tables talk about how, so I want you to think about how do you see this in higher education? And let me give you an example of a hiring committee. Okay? So you know how hiring committees work. The description's written, the people are picked, a little bit into it, they realize there's nobody of color on the hiring committee, so they go find somebody. It's the same person who's always getting tapped, but not getting paid any more money. Am I making this up? Okay, and then, so there you are on this committee, and they ask that person to write the diversity question. It's called that, just you do the diversity question. And then when you're assessing the answers to the diversity question, what this person seeks as a good answer, none of the white people, right, they disagree on what a good answer is. And so eventually the person of color relents and just says, okay, fine. And then, phew, everybody's relieved. And they finally choose their final candidate based on fit and who will hit the ground running. So at your tables, talk through how whiteness, white fragility, and racism is manifesting on that committee, right? What are the dynamics? And what might happen if this person actually shares what they were supposedly asked to be on the committee to share, okay? So just kind of how you can use that as a model about how you've seen whiteness and white fragility function in terms of hiring, okay? All right, I'm going to call you back. Welcome back. Oh, that's good. Welcome back. Thank you. I want to have an opportunity for people to ask questions. So I want to leave you with an image of what I believe would radically transform this. You know, if this was under the dock rather than what's under there now, right? I don't believe we can get there from the dominant paradigm, right? It functions really beautifully to protect the present racial order, right? So, and if you like this image, by the way, because I saw some folks taking pictures, you can download a handout that has all this on it from my website, okay? So, I believe that if whites were really coming from this place, not only would our interpersonal relationships change, but so would our institutions, because we would see to it that they changed. So this understanding that being good or bad is not relevant, it's a system infused in everything. Whites have blind spots on racism. I have blind spots on racism. Racism's complex. I don't have to understand it in order for it to be valid. White comfort maintains the status quo, so discomfort is necessary and important. We're not going to get there from a place of white comfort, but I must not confuse that with safety. I am perfectly safe. What I like to ask white people is, what does it mean to need to feel safe from a position of historical, social, institutional, cultural power and privilege? All right, I guess that's all I had to ask. All right. Right? I bring my group's history with me. History matters. It's a history of harm. And no, I won't be automatically granted the benefit of the doubt. I need to earn it. The question is not if, but how. right? Dominant culture's question is, was or wasn't that racism? And as soon as you put an either or, you'll never agree. My question is, how was racism manifested in that situation? It's in the water, right? All whites are unconsciously invested in this system, including me. And most of that is implicit, right? I need to do a lot of work if I'm going to be able to identify that. Good intentions and self-image are not enough. Feedback from people of color indicates trust, right? They're taking an incredible risk across power to give you that feedback, given the history of harm. So let go of how you get it, right? It takes courage to break with white solidarity. So how do I support other white folks who are trying to break with white solidarity, rather than punish them? Given socialization, it's more likely that I'm the one that doesn't understand what's going on. Can you imagine if white people were coming from that place? White males I would love to have come from that place also. But when it comes to racism, the way society is set up, I get to be the determiner. From all that I've showed you, all that socialization, we're the ones that are unbiased, and we're the ones who get to decide whether it's real or not, right? So finally, racism hurts, even kills people of color 24/7. Interrupting it is more important than my ego, my self-image, right? My feelings. And I really believe that if we were coming from this place, we would be in a very different situation. And so when white people ask me, what do? I just say, whatever it takes to internalize this so that it's real for you. So that's what I will leave you with, and then I'll open the floor to questions, comments, etc. I don't think it's on. And I'm hard of hearing, so. And while she's fussing with it, whew,
Is that on now?
Fast.
Okay, thanks. I can't tell how loud it is. So thank you so much for the talk, which was both incredibly informative and wildly and interesting and entertaining and fun to listen to, which I really appreciate, because it's not an easy thing. And I need some advice on how to deal with the universalist arguments. Because what I am finding is that people are coming up with really intellectually highfalutin, but they think robust responses to diversity efforts and their implementation on campuses by saying things like identity politics is really divisive, it feeds a politics of resentment, you can have rational communication across difference that focuses on commonality and doesn't emphasize grievance.
Wow.
And it's not just kind of complainy universalism, it's backed up with Hegel and Habermas and Balibar and like all these kind of high theory approaches to understanding dynamics of power, post-Enlightenment thinking, how that informs political theory and democratic processes. And so it's not your kind of run-of-the-mill, why don't we all just get along? And other than saying you require an incredible degree of hubris to imagine that the human experience is only understandable through these German philosophers, I'm struggling with coming up with a convincing response that doesn't just indict people. But maybe I don't know, maybe it just needs to be indicted, but that's something I've been thinking about a lot lately.
And it's the million-dollar question, right? Basically, how do you move forward white people who hold the power? And to be honest, people of color certainly can collude with their own oppression, and so they can be used in those ways, right? But let's focus on the majority is going to be white people, and when people of color collude with racism, it still holds up white supremacy, right? So none of that is accounting for power. I mean, that's the bottom line, right? So if you could try the question of, so how do you see that functioning how do you see it functioning? How does it function to not do identity politics Where have we not done it, and what has been the outcome? So maybe if you could just keep moving people towards what is the outcome of what we've been doing, and what would shift if we tried a different theoretical lens. Sometimes I use a Marxist theory analysis, so I'll say, how many of you have ever taken Marxist theory? And maybe 5 people will raise their hands. Did you pass? Yeah. Did you become Marxist? No. So you weren't required to be a Marxist to pass the class. Okay. But you were required to grapple with Marxist theory, achieve some degree of mastery, and probably your final project was apply a Marxist analysis to this situation, right? Whether you agree or disagree with Marxism is not really relevant. A Marxist analysis is going to generate different questions and therefore different responses. We have not yet applied an anti-racist analysis. Let's try it. And then they can just let go. It's not brainwashing. You don't have to. Okay. Okay. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. So as I was listening to you, what kind of came to mind, and currently something that I've been having some conversations about is these ideas of safe spaces and trigger words in university campuses. And I think on this campus, there's been, as far as I know, 2 big lectures on freedom of speech at the university. And so what I've been thinking about is like that there's this confusion of like, the academic debate in a classroom setting where the professor is quite aware of what the intentionality is there, but then this idea of safe spaces and trigger words are conflated with that and thinking that like, oh, that's gonna prevent that kind of, academic, scholarly work from happening. And I feel like it comes from this place of not interrupting that white-dominated space. And so I wondered if you had kind of a response to that of like folks who are telling, who are speaking about, safe spaces should not exist, that's not productive, and trigger words are, like counter to the university's mission, for example.
So do these tend to be white people kind of using it as a way to say, look, we can't have these difficult conversations because it can trigger some white students and they'll feel bad?
No.
Okay.
So safe spaces and triggers have been, some, I think, forms of trying to recognize the fact that students of color often feel, put to the side or unsafe in different spaces around the university, okay. But the fact that that safe spaces or triggered words would exist are actually being, presented as counter to a freedom of speech at the university.
Yeah. Well, one, I don't think you can ever create a safe space. It's certainly not that's mixed, right? Because the very things that will feel safe for one set of people is not going to be exactly what doesn't feel safe for another, right? So for white people, what feels safe is no conflict, no challenge, right? And that's exactly what will feel inauthentic often to students of color, right? So this very idea that you could create a safe space that's universal, we're back to not accounting for power, right? Where I go to, I remember back when, you can't talk about, LGBT issues because you have to respect people's religious backgrounds, all of that. You do have a mission to create an environment where everyone can learn, right? I mean, you can fall back to that. And a hostile classroom climate is not a space where everyone can learn, right? And that there's a deep history of harm around these expressions. And I think the key is, can you get people to examine what they think and believe as opposed to just state it as if it's fact? Right? And this is, it takes faculty having the skills, and can I just say it? Most faculty are white, am I right? And do not have the skills. And it's kind of if I'm for social justice, I automatically do social justice, right? We don't need to have a class on that. It's integrated in everything because we're all good people that are for social justice. This is usually how it goes. So there's also the piece of faculty not having those skills and still being seen as competent and qualified. I actually don't think you're competent or qualified if you don't have those skills. These are, again, really going to be heavily resisted, but those are just some avenues in that I think about. I saw a hand right there that responds to what I said. Oh, okay, go ahead. Yeah, I think, yeah, go ahead.
If you want to live in a more integrated community, how do you do that without also contributing to gentrification and displacement? Do those go hand in hand? Like if a white family wants to move into a more diverse community, are you contributing to that?
And those are really hard, deep, complex issues, right? But often there are ways to move into environments that certainly minimize that impact, but that's not usually what happens, and it's not really authentically, I don't believe, why white families are moving into those neighborhoods. Other than the cultural capital of saying I live with diversity, but are they actually building relationships? Are they supporting small businesses that are owned by people of color? Are their children going to the local schools? Usually not. So I don't think the only way to have a more integrated life is just where you live. It's also, what are you involved in? How do you get yourself out of your comfort zone? But if you move into a neighborhood that's predominantly people of color, how are you doing that? And there's some really good writing and kind of ideas about how to do that in a much more conscious way.
I think we only have time for maybe one more question. I better defer it. I was going to ask it, but I'll happily defer.
Hello, thank you so much. I work with Native American students, and I have this question as I've looked at racial equity models that, and I'm interested to know how you would look at this, that sometimes when you're asked as a person of color, I'm going to speak from Native students, to educate all the time non-Native. So as a student in the academy, you're constantly educating your professors, your classmates all the time. And is this a subordinate position to be educating non-Natives, or whites in this instance, all the time? And if it is a subordinate position, and my idea is that I'm constantly giving. I'm giving you my knowledge, my patience, my time, my energy, and you're absorbing it, especially the progressive, progressive people, they're taking it in. But what do I get out of that? And is it that there should be a co-teaching or a co-learning? And then the follow-up is, as people of color, are we supposed to be learning from white people in this process, or is that not my job to do? Is that for you to sit with? So it's am I taking a subordinate position by constantly educating when you're not doing the work that you need to, even if you're progressive? And then am I supposed to be learning something alongside you?
Okay, so my sense, and I saw two women look disappointed, and you had a reaction to what she said, and I'm happy to have you, if you wanted to speak to that question, and then I have my thoughts. I just wanted to. Yeah. Yeah.
That's a great question, and the answer to that is no. People need to do their own homework. Your life force and energy, you decide. Every time you give it away like that, you're not able to give it to family, friends, and to yourself for self-care. That's really, really important. And I just wanted to add, I think it would be, because you are a white person speaking about this, so of course that puts you in a position of authority, and I enjoy your work. So this is not about your work, but it's really important to constantly remind people that if yours was a black face or a Latina face, this would have been experienced completely differently by the people in the room. And so really making it clear that because I'm white standing here, that's also part of the whole systems of oppression, I think is important.
Mm-hmm.
And I just want to make a quick comment, because the white-black frame, for me, what's the loss that I hear in your presentation is the loss of the individual truth when you're white, when black folks show up. In other words, you're not white until there's black people there. When there are no black people there, you are Cheryl or Johnny or James or the grandfather's descendant or whatever. When black people show up, then you're white. And I just make a comment of sitting in a doctoral program at Harvard with a white, only black woman, 2 black men, a white woman who said, there's no racism in my community. We don't have any black people there. So my last question, Harvard doctoral. So here's my question, just not for you to necessarily answer it, but for all of us to contemplate that. How do you deal with those 2 paradoxes? You're only white when I'm there, and I'm struggling with being Cheryl rather than the first black, the only black, the exceptional black, the typical black, the no good black, because I'm defined by being black in some context. And the second piece is, how do you in a dispassionate research university deal with content that is emotionally charged off the chain, and we never talk about the application of emotional intelligence and strategies? And then lastly, my best friend is white that helped raise my kid. So we have these conflicts about our generalizations across the lines.
My sense is that, I mean, those were powerful points that you both made that I don't necessarily feel that I have to respond to, other than maybe the way I try to get white people to understand that race is profound from the moment they're born is in those kinds of questions, looking at our neighborhoods, and I hope I modeled, I mean, it was a relatively short period of time, but modeled how I keep trying to move them away from this sense of it's about individuals, and it's really about from the time we open our eyes, and even where we open our eyes and how we got there, and who owns the hospital we're opening our eyes in, and on and on and on, we are being shaped. So that's a huge commitment of mine, is to get white people to understand that. And yes, the way I'm heard, and this is that master's tools dilemma, right? As I stand in the front of the room, I am reinforcing the authority of the white voice. And because white folks will hear it more openly from me, to not do that for me, to not use this position to challenge racism, is to really be white. Right? And that, so it's a both end. And so I acknowledge that, and I thank you very much. And everybody else, thank you so much.
Thank you, Robin. Thank you very much.